compassion and care and concern and love and all those good things in life that we don't hear being talked about enough is like a muscle. The more you use it, the more you extend it to other entities that are deserving of our moral consideration. I think it comes down to things like laziness, what the Greeks often called akrasia, which is a weakness of will. So you just inhabit, I just like the taste of meat. I don't really have a strong argument for it. So it's kind of an arbitrariness and an unwillingness in a way to follow the logic of the argument, which to me is a sign of moral weakness and or intellectual weakness, that you can agree with the general premise, the directions of leading to the conclusion, but you don't like the conclusion because it would mean a change in your lifestyle or it mean you may have to make difficult decisions.
Good afternoon, John. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine, and greetings from Linköping in Sweden, where I'm spending the next couple of weeks as a visiting fellow here in the university.
Oh, wow. I thought you'd be at home in Belfast, but you're traveling.
I sadly have moved from Ireland, where it's now beautiful and sunny, to Sweden, where it's a bit miserable and damp, to be honest.
Bad timing, bad timing. But it's nearly always sunny in Ireland, so I'm sure it'll be fine when you get back.
I don't know who told you that, but we often have a saying, summer in Ireland, best weekend of the year.
Yeah, don't blink or you'll miss it. Yeah. Well, it's brilliant to get the chance to have another conversation because we met, albeit again still on Zoom, in a humanist climate action panel where by some administrative mistake they brought me on as a supposed expert. I was great to be on the panel with you and with Zion Lights, who's actually a previous Sentientism guest as well, and Laurie Marriott. So we had a fascinating conversation about the climate crisis and some of the taboos around that and the imperatives that we see to try and address that. So that was great, but it's now brilliant to get you on as a guest here and to drag you through some of our sort of deep philosophical questions and to understand your utopian visions too. So as I've explained to you, I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, and also one that most of humanity still gets wrong, in my humble opinion. The questions of what's real and how do we understand the universe, questions of epistemology, I guess, but also just as importantly, the questions of ethics, what matters and who matters. And I have an obvious bias because the name of this podcast and YouTube series is Sentientism, which is the name of a really pluralistic, open worldview I'm trying to promote and develop, that suggests when it comes to the epistemological questions, we, with a big dose of humility, should commit to using evidence and reason and a broadly naturalistic approach to understanding this strange world we all share. And on the ethical side, it's pretty pluralistic and open about ethical systems, but it does insist that every sentient being, at least, should matter seriously in our moral considerations, and a sentient being a being that can feel, that can experience things, that can value its own experiences in its own life. And in a way, that's the suggested grounding for a sentientist moral stance. But I'm talking in these conversations to people whether they agree or disagree with that worldview. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and how that leads into the work you do now. But before we get on to those questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for those who haven't come across you so far?
Yes, I'm by day a mild-mannered professor of green political economy at Queen's University, Belfast. I also co-chair the Belfast Climate Commission. I am a recovering politician. I used to be leader of the Green Party in Northern Ireland for almost a decade, and I was 7 years in the molehills of power as a Green Party councillor from 2011, 2019. So I'm a rather unusual academic in that way. I've always been politically active, and I've always refused and can never quite understand the reticence amongst a lot of my colleagues, particularly people doing political theory or philosophy, that all they could do is stay in the classroom or writing. And important as that is, I feel compelled that at this moment of crisis, the polycrisis, the climate and ecological and associated social and indeed animal welfare horrors of the current social order, I feel compelled to actually step out of the academy and put my shoulder to the wheel, as it were, and get involved in politics, public speaking, media work. So that's basically me. I'm a kind of a dissident political economist. I don't accept either capitalism or endless economic growth, and we may get into that. I'm also quite skeptical that our current economic system has now passed its sell-by date in terms of industrialization, globalism, and not least around, the horrendous suffering of the more than human world as a result of that. So for me, we're at a threshold moment in terms of the crises are getting worse. I was reading a report you may have seen in The Guardian just this week about the levels of, I suppose, depression amongst a lot of climate scientists, how they are now much more pessimistic about keeping global average temperatures to below 1.5 degrees. They are describing, in many respects, an uninhabitable world in the future. And so, for all those reasons, I would like to, make an appeal for any academic colleagues that are listening. You know, we cannot continue in a business as usual manner in the academy while the world is on fire.
Yeah, thank you. Not a time for hiding in an ivory tower if there ever was such a time. So,
We need to practice what we teach, if you want to use that term, that many of us have privilege. I mean, it's unevenly spread within the academy, certainly. There are high levels of precarious paid, colleagues. But I do feel, particularly as a senior member of the profession, a professor, that it's those of us in those senior areas of our profession with economic security, and perhaps like me, looking at I can now begin to see the horizon of retirement, that we do have a particular onus in terms of, stepping up and stepping out at this time, not only of crisis, it is also of great opportunity. We can fix so many problems in our society if we tackle the climate and ecological crisis using science, using political will, using a justice focus, and that justice extending not just to our own, societies, but to global societies for global justice, intergenerational justice, and of course, the big frontier in terms of interspecies justice and equity. And it seems to me that's the realm that we're now in. And I'm more than willing intellectually, whatever I can do, but also politically and in terms of, in a way, spreading the word amongst our citizens and those who are willing to listen, that we have all the solutions that we need, but what we lack often is the political will and the ethical courage of our convictions.
yeah, thank you. And we'll return to some of those themes later, of course. So let me drag you back to some of the philosophical fundamentals, I guess, that might underpin your thinking and your activism and your academic work today. And the first question we like to start with in common sense terms is the question about what's real and how do we work out what's real? And that's a massively broad question because it addresses every field of our beliefs and credences and what we might think is true or likely to be true. But often an interesting way into the story is to explore with my guests whether they grew up originally in maybe a more spiritual or religious or supernaturally minded culture and family, or one that was maybe more scientifically minded, atheistic, agnostic, naturalistic, and how that side of their thinking, the deep question of what is this reality we all share and, how that's changed through their life if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to sort of tell that story if that's a good way in.
Well, as most people can hear from my accent, I'm Irish. I'm originally from Dublin. If you ever seen the film The Commitments, that's where I'm from, the great proletarian working class reservations on the outskirts of Dublin. So even though I've described myself now not just as a lapsed but completely collapsed Catholic, and I've been an atheist all my thinking life, I was raised a Catholic, but very early on, I don't know what age, maybe 9 or 10. I began to seriously doubt what's the evidence for this off-world male white deity, not really finding satisfactory answers either from the priest or teacher. So I began that journey that many people do in terms of moving away from the faith they were brought up in. But at the same time, I do hold some affection for Catholicism, not least because, unlike certain brands of, say, Protestant evangelicalism, of which I'm very familiar with because I live here in the north of Ireland, where there are high levels of Protestant evangelicalism, where you find these are folk who reject evolution, who often then reject climate change. But it seems to me that Catholicism, despite its many, flaws, and of which there are many, not least the horrendous abuse of women, particularly within the church, and the sexual scandals that effectively, brought down the church, certainly in Ireland, from its position of power. But there was always a comfortableness within Catholicism about accepting science. There was no particular issue. And as I was growing up, you could have religion, you could have catechism, and then into biology or and then about evolution was no issue there. But for me, as I said, like a lot of people, I began to move away from that spiritual, metaphysical understanding of the world, even though I still, have an affection for it as a form of poetry. I mean, for me, it was to be generous. I mean, I see most religious perspectives as beautiful stories. They're fairy tales. They're beautiful, but they're not real. But it doesn't make them any less beautiful or aesthetically interesting, or they can have certain, morality lessons in those tales. So I'm not taking away from, the power of storytelling and narrative. But certainly, having a naturalistic understanding of the world in terms of cause and effect and the basic functions, the biophysical, rules that govern all life, has led me in my intellectual journey now as an academic that, the reality is we're not just like animals. We are animals. We are a species of animals. So why on earth do we think that the same laws, ecological, physical, that govern other forms of life, that human beings are somehow exceptional in being removed from them? So for me, that materialist analysis has always been really important. But again, not to the extent that I would exclude the interest and importance for human beings in terms of meaning making, in terms of there are ineffable, there are, some things in life, where did the universe begin and what is the meaning of life and so on. These things a purely naturalistic understanding can't explain. And that's where I think there is room for certain metaphysical understandings of what makes life meaningful. I mean, for me, it's very simple. It's the old Socratic version is that, the meaning of life is to live a life of meaning, in terms of making your life matter in terms of its impact on the world and other people around you, including, in terms of my own moral compass, it always has included parts of the more than human world. I'd probably balk at, the inanimate world, although I'm open to persuasion, thinking like a mountain or, rights of rivers and mountains, which have been awarded in New Zealand and Ecuador, Bolivia, based on indigenous thinking. So I do respect those metaphysical kind of understandings of the world that people make sense of the world. But, just to finish, in the same way that everybody can have their own opinions, you can't have your own facts.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like the trigger for you moving away from a Catholic supernatural worldview, even as a kid, was more the sort of facts and the evidence and the does this feel true stuff. But later on, as you talked about, there were some things about, morality there too. And it's been interesting with my guests because sometimes it's that way around. And other times it's some of the moral stuff that can be where the first cracks appear, where they're like, why has there never been a female gay pope or, whatever it is. And then from there, they start to question. So how did that balance? Was it very much a facts and evidence thing? And it was later that you came to see some of the moral challenges or?
Well, I think, when I began to doubt religion at that young age, or at what, 9 or 10, I probably didn't have enough knowledge of the world or a sophisticated understanding of ethics beyond a rudimentary sense that children often have of good and bad and what's right and wrong. But as I got older, and certainly when I began becoming politically active at university, 17, 18, it was a big campaign in the 1980s when I was at university, in the University College Dublin, around abortion. Obviously, a big issue in a Catholic context. And I just could not understand the life of me why Ireland, dominated as it was by the Catholic Church, was content to send often poor women off to England for backstreet abortions, where many of them died or were irreparably physically harmed, and this was okay. I really railed against the kind of shoving down our throats, even as university students, being shown, pictures of aborted fetuses in class, because I was at that time, it was a school of politics and ethics. And the ethics wasn't environmental ethics or utilitarianism. It was a cipher for the Catholic Church. So I was taught by priests and nuns who clearly had a very strong anti-abortion perspective. So therein began my rebellion against this, because I couldn't see the logic of it, not least because it seemed to me the greater harm was being committed in sending these women off in shame, but also to put themselves in harm's way for the sake of something that I just couldn't understand, this idea that life begins at conception and so on. I just couldn't see the evidence for that, or I wasn't convinced by any of the arguments. So, but sorry, that was a big moral dilemma that I know I'm not unique in that. It's that issue of, well, A, the whole question of, life beginning and being sacred and so on at conception, but it's more this emerging kind of feminist analysis in terms of why women, they seem to be that the Catholic Church was just anti-women in this way, but also, as you just mentioned, where's the female pope? Where's the female priest and the female bishop? Never mind the pope. So it was that sense that here we had a metaphysical view of the world that was, in this case, causing, irreparable harm to people who did not deserve it. And also then finally, because I could see that the women who are going to London were often poor working class women, my kind of class awareness, and I still describe myself as a bit of a Marxist as a result of that, and seeing that class as well as gender and race, and indeed speciesism, which we can get into, are all intersectionally connected, but certainly that beginnings of my own kind of class consciousness. There was people from my community, women from my community and my class that were being harmed by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, thank you. And what sort of response did you get? Because for some of my guests who've moved away from a religious worldview, it just sort of faded into the background. It was pretty unremarkable, and it's just never really been an important thing for them. For others at the other extreme, some have actually had deeply traumatic experiences of moving away from a religious worldview, which in some cases presented very serious, not just social, but physical risk in some situations. And Ireland and Northern Ireland aren't necessarily places that always present the most extreme risk, but they are places where religion runs pretty deep. What sort of response was there to your moving away from a Catholic faith?
Well, I certainly at home, my parents were, they weren't strongly religious, although I do remember, saying prayers as a family, the rosary and so on, but that kind of faded even as I was getting older. I was also quite a lippy child, which probably won't come as any surprise to you, and always questioning. And
I didn't think you would be the sort of kid who kept your head down and play the
no,
role.
I was never that person. I always wanted to, why, explain. But I did it in a way that I think was often funny and irreverent. So it wasn't a kind of a an antagonistic way of doing it, although that doesn't mean to say that people who came across me didn't experience that exchange as such. And so I think my parents accepted that, particularly as I went to university, there was a kind of an implicit, and again, this would be common for a lot of people, that the more educated you become, the less likely you are to believe in religion. It's almost like that's part of the deal, is that um, the more knowledge you have, you can say, hold on a minute, how can we believe in this stuff? Because it's often based on ignorance. So I never got any particular backlash from my parents. All my peers at the time were all moving in the same direction. So there was a general kind of shedding of the Catholic faith, to the extent now that, for example, my mother absolutely detests the church and regrets how many years of her life she spent in being loyal to it. My dad is still quite religious. So for me, there wasn't any particular trauma. Even my social life wasn't affected. I know for other people it's different, where religion becomes so all-encompassing that their entire, entity is tied up with their church. I had other interests in sports and getting involved in politics. So no, certainly for me it wasn't. It was more a curiosity as to how so many of my fellow citizens were still in hock or still believing this story, which didn't really bear any scrutiny. And there were better stories. You could still keep, as I always told people, you can keep the major tenets of Catholicism or Christianity or Judaism or Islam. It's basically do unto others as you want to do unto yourself, be just, be kind, leave the world a better place. You can do all of those good things without a belief in a supernatural deity and these bizarre rules that often these dead white men have bequeathed to society. So for me, it was always about how can we take the good of what religion can offer, and there is some good tenets in there in terms of basic principles of how to live and so on, but then ditch all this crap which was just harming and no longer useful.
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like you and I share a broadly naturalistic worldview now. You have respect for alternative perspectives and different points of view. And you also have that humility to recognize that naturalism doesn't guarantee we're going to know everything. And there may well be some things we never find out. But to my mind, that's part of what good naturalism is, right? That doubt, that humility, that never being too sure, because even if you have a scientific worldview, as soon as you're 100% sure, you're trapped in your own dogma. So, yeah, so no, I really like that way of putting it. Thank you for telling the story.
It's a nice way of summarizing that. I've used it often, is that I think it's André Gide, the great French novelist, who said, trust those who search for the truth, but doubt those who say they found it. And I think that's a good watchword for us all. And that, in a way, reflects why I rebelled, particularly against Catholicism or even certain forms of Marxism, to be honest, is that dogmatism, that absolute certainty. And that's why I often thought that Marxism is often described as a Christian heresy. It has the same kind of, development trajectory in its analysis. So you got the prelapse area, and you got this sense of in the Garden of Eden, that's primitive communism when people were living together as equal. Then you got the fall, and that's in the Bible, obviously, eaten from the tree of knowledge. In Marxist theory, it's the rise of capitalism. And then you got a redemption in terms of, Jesus coming on earth or communism. And there's something I've always held, and maybe it's why I'm still a Marxist and have still some affection for Catholicism, is that redemption. It seems to me that that is an important element of understanding who we are and motivating us to work. That you want to redeem our broken world. And part of me, it's about trying to, de-spiritualize that religious sense of redemption, because I do think redemption is an important, part of the human condition. And that's why I suppose I could see the similarities between Catholicism and Marxism in that way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you've done a beautiful segue for me into the second set of questions about ethics. And that's sometimes an interesting dynamic for someone who's moved away from a religious worldview, because quite often this next question of what matters was originally grounded in the religion. It comes as part of the package. And then there can be a tricky period when people are moving away from a religion because they don't think it's true, to like, okay, well, do I need to start from scratch with my morality? My guess is that your morality was probably never that grounded in a religious worldview in the first place. So maybe you didn't have those challenges. But again, it'd be interesting to know that story about, even from the earliest times, you first thought about, what do good and bad, right and wrong mean? And what do you think are those fundamentals now? Is it about solidarity, justice, fairness, redemption, suffering, freedom, autonomy? How do you think about the real roots of morality now?
And again, it's almost like a childlike view of right and wrong. It's based in harm. How can we go through life without causing harm, or certainly minimizing the harm that we cause? And I think that then you can add on then things like solidarity with those who also can be harmed. Harm then brings you to questions of vulnerability and the uneven distribution, because there are certain creatures and humans and classes in society that are more vulnerable than others. So for me, harm, and that's why when I went to university, I absolutely devoured Peter Singer and utilitarianism, at least as he expressed it. I mean, I kind of liked John Stuart Mill's writing and Jeremy Bentham as well, but they were written in a language that was, well, it's 19th century they were writing in, and didn't quite connect. But Singer, I really could understand, because he then used utilitarianism. I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, or maybe people listen to the pod.
And Peter's been a guest as well, which is
Has he?
fantastic.
Oh, well, fantastic. Because his essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality, was quite significant for me. It's an old 1970s article that he wrote in terms of a utilitarian view about how we should help others who are suffering in the world. But then he could use that utilitarian view in terms of why we should extend this now to, animals and other sentient beings. And at that time, that helped give me a philosophical grounding for something that I was already uncomfortable about, which is the whole meat eating. And this is probably a similar story for many guests as well, in terms of understanding that, we're brought up with stories of Larry the Lamb, and animals are these, kind of morality vectors, and they're beautiful in the children's storybook. And then suddenly you're eating Larry the Lamb at the table. And for me, it was like that wake up moment. Hold on a minute. So the lamb is this beautiful creature is presented, really colorfully in these children's books, and we slaughter them. Or even then playing around with the word. Why don't we call it flesh? Why do we call it meat? Or why is that thing not called a slice of cow? We call it sirloin. And it just started to understand, oh my, there's a whole set of ways of putting a veil over what it is that we're doing to these creatures. And then realizing with horror one Sunday morning, because like a lot of working class families, you always had a big fry up of a Sunday. And I love black pudding. And of course, I then realized this is blood. This is blood pudding, as they call it, and being appalled to think that I've been eating blood and then eating flesh, even though the taste, of course, was nice. But then trying to connect, as I always try and do, as we all should do, how do you connect consumption with production? And therein began, an awakening around diet and discovering there's a reason why abattoirs don't have glass walls. There's a reason why, we have to have these forms of sequestering the harm to animals clearly, but also the horrendous pollution and other manifold negative impacts of a very heavy meat-based diet, which of course I'm much more aware of now, having studied it and taught it. But even then, having that rudimentary sense that this is not right, the way we're treating these creatures, because they can feel, so that rudimentary sense, I suppose, of a utilitarian or sentiist perspective on the world.
Yeah, thank you. And when you talk about harm and avoiding causing harm, that can be thought of at least a couple of ways. One is it's about me as a moral agent, maybe even in a sort of virtuous sense, not wanting to do wrong to others. So that's about me in a way and the things I'm trying not to cause. There's a different perspective, which is think about it from the perspective of those being harmed and thinking, well, the reason I don't want to harm is because of their experience of that harm. And it's the fact that they're suffering that matters, not whether I'm causing it or not, whether there are moral agents involved. It's about them ultimately. Is there a bit of both or one or the other for you? Or
It's both, because it's, I've also, as well as having probably in an inordinate affection for Catholicism and metaphysical views of the world, I'm also really fascinated by ancient Greek philosophy. And I've always had a partiality to virtue ethics. In other words, that our ethical perspective is based upon who you are, the cultivation of certain dispositions, in part because I could see that the ways in which certainly the ancient Greeks viewed it, because we live in an uncertain and unknowable world, you cannot have kind of moral or other rules to determine what's the right course of action. You need, in a way, to have dispositions that enable you to react in appropriate manners in the certain context. So I've always been quite fond of a virtue ethics and the importance of your character. In other words, I'm not the type of person to do that. At the same time, I don't see any incompatibility with having that perspective on, part of your ethical worldview, but also one based upon establishing, what are the properties of those which can be harmed? Do they feel pleasure and pain and so on? And therefore that gives you another, tool in your ethical, toolbox, as it were, to help you navigate a very complex and uncertain world. So for me, it was both. And then finally, for me, and partly again, it's this kind of materialist class experience I've had and expressed in this kind of Marxist perspective that I've always held. As I was learning these at university, these Singer and virtue ethics and other, forms of knowledge, I was actually also working in McDonald's in O'Connell Street in Dublin, or as I describe it now, I was being exploited by this horrendous company that paid students or workers very, very little. And then seeing, they weren't slaughtering cows out the back alley and then we were chopping them into burgers, but just seeing the amount of meat I had to cook every day and the stench of it. And at that time, I'd already gone vegetarian. And so even though if you work in McDonald's, I don't know if it's the case now, but certainly back then, Yes, you were paid very low wages, but you were given an allocation where you had like £5 worth of a meal. You could just, in other words, get a free meal. And I refused to eat any of the food because I said, this is horrible meat. Even the potatoes are not proper potatoes. They're made from kind of, ground up starch, whatever. That's this crap food. I need to bring my own sandwiches in. And this already caused, initially, I think, curiosity and a bit of humor, and then a sense of anger or what's going on here from senior managers. Because what I did then, but thankfully they didn't know it was me, because McDonald's is notorious anti-union. In fact, I remember when I was, we had an induction event and it was an old VHS tape. That's how long ago it was. And part of the induction event was to tell us not to join unions because unions are a waste of time. They take your hard-earned wages away from you. And I was brought up in a very strong trade union family, and I said, this is absolute nonsense. So I put up a sign. Thankfully, I didn't sign it in the staff room about inviting people to a local pub after work to come and set up a branch of a union. Oh my God, hell broke loose in terms of management, wanting to find out. I think even people flew in from London because this was unprecedented and so on. So for me, it already demonstrated that here we have my experience in working McDonald's, the horrendous suffering of animals. And I was very aware of the, clear felling of Costa Rican at that time rainforest to enable, ranching and so on. And they were exploiting workers at the same time and refusing to enable them the basic human right of collective bargaining, organize a trade union. And so for me, there was no, difference. These were all absolutely interconnected with one another. So it only bolstered in a way my own kind of intersectional sense of justice, which was justice to the non-human world, justice to my fellow workers, indeed the consumers who were being fed crap food that tasted very nice only because there was chemicals in it, and so on. So for me, it was useful, working in that environment as a sense check and a reality to some of the things I was learning about while I was at university in terms of, what we've now called green politics. Back then it was called ecology and so on. So I could see all these things being interconnected.
Yeah, thank you. And it may seem an odd question to ask here, but I think it fits, which is about, I guess, economics. And you've been talking about some of the implications there, and it's obviously central to your work too, because people will often think about, economics as a subject, and I think it's about money and transactions and growth and whatever else. In a way, I think economics ultimately is about value. And that value tracks back to the stuff we're talking about, which is ultimately things that matter to individuals, human or non-human. So again, this is probably a 3-hour lecture rather than a quick question, but what's happened to economics that it's become detached from the sort of value that you and I are talking about and that I think most humans recognize in their own lives?
Yes, to go back to the ancient Greeks, where again, my PhD dissertation partly looked at this. In ancient Greek, there were two versions of what we now call economy. One was oikonomia, which was management of the households, and that's what we would conventionally say is a kind of an integrated systems level view of what the economy is in terms of the metabolism between the human and the non-human, issues of work and labor and so on. And then a separate issue, which the Greeks pointed out, called kremestistics, which is money making. And they could see that actually that was a corruption of economics. If you're only interested in simply making money, that could actually lead then to maladaptive and suboptimal ways of managing the household. You fast forward that very quickly then to the ways in which, certainly the latter part of the 19th century, when you get this shift from what was called political economy, people like Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill, they were political economists. And in fact, many, eminent economists up until the late 19th century, they were, members of philosophy departments. So, in other words, there was no separation between ethics, politics, and economics up until you had the emergence of what's called the marginalist revolution, where capitalism is developing, very strongly, emerging class divisions within society. And at the same time, then you get this kind of importing of engineering and physics into economics, that somehow economics becomes a science and it becomes detached from politics and power, the state, ethics, and so on. And so the tradition or the knowledge base that I describe myself as in, I'm a green political economist. I'm always upfront about you cannot divorce economics from ethics and so on. And it really does annoy me, and annoyed me so much that I spent all my academic career railing against it, is in demonstrating why dominant understandings of economics, which are largely what's called neoclassical economics, or in my view, capitalist economics, they pretend that they're neutral and objective. They have these fancy econometric, modeling and mathematicized equations. And it sounds very scientific, but if it's so scientific, why couldn't that brand of economics predict the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008? I mean, that's the mark of a science. It's got predictive qualities, but it's more to see that what passes for economics from the boardroom to the bar room, what you hear in the news, on the radio, and so on, you read in the newspaper for the most part, is only one brand of economics. In the same way that you just don't have one brand of politics, we welcome, you would expect variety, debate, and discussion around how we should organize our politics. That's what democracy ultimately is about. It's about variety and debate and discussion. Why on earth do we think that when it comes to the economy, that there's only one version of managing the economy, or indeed one version of understanding economics? Part of, as I say, is that it's not as if modern economics in its dominant form has lost its ethical basis. It's simply hidden it. It smuggles in its ethical commitments in things like axioms. It assumes that human beings are rational, we're acquisitive, we're accumulating, and so on. We're like these pleasure machines. I'm not denying that there are elements of the human condition that are like that, but we're also cooperative. We also can reach levels of sufficiency where we have enough. We don't need to consume more and more. So for me, as an academic, kind of getting into the weeds of understanding the normative basis of contemporary economics was really to reveal that it's an ideology. But then again, every form of economics is ideological. It's normative. There is no value-free understanding of the human economy. But yet, every year, just to finish, economics departments across the world, because this neoclassical economics model is the dominant, or discipline is the dominant model that's pretending to students that it's value-free and neutral and it's like a science. It means that we're producing every year in higher education thousands and thousands of what I would call technically competent barbarians. These are people who are able to manipulate these formal, econometric models, and the world works for them because of the assumptions they've made. But actually, in the real world, as we found with the booms and the busts, certainly with the ecological crisis, which is in part caused by the lack of attention being paid by neoclassical economics, in particular, to the real roots of our economy lie in energy, resources, and land. And the fact that, neoclassical economics is fundamentally ecologically ignorant and irrational. We have to understand that this dominant understanding of economics is ideological, but it hides in plain sight in that it's accepted as a common sense view of the world and the way the economy has to be managed. We have to have GDP growth, and so nobody actually stops to ask that childlike question. Why do we need endless GDP growth? What is GDP growth? Does it make people better off? Who's gaining the most from economic growth? Is it providing more jobs? Are people healthier and happier as a result of that? These questions are very rarely asked. And the reason being is that modern economics is a key element of the armory, the ideological and practical armory of maintaining, in my view, an ecocidal and suboptimal capitalist system.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll come back to that in a bit too. And I guess this link to value is really interesting to me, because I think as you say, there are all sorts of implicit and hidden assumptions and axioms, but a couple little that spring to mind. One is that the exclusion of value that can't be monetized from the systems of measurement or consideration. So there are many things that you and I and other humans see are deeply valuable that just aren't counted as economic things at all, but also the conception of the non-human, because one of the unstated assumptions is that only humans can be consumers of value, and the things that are valued by non-humans just are irrelevant, which consigns non-humans, sentient and non-human, to be purely commodities. I mean, they can be nothing but used and objectified for the creation of monetized value for humans. So, and you talked already about that a little bit about that part of your journey, about this second question of who matters, this question of moral scope, because it sounds like there quite early you were asking those questions about, the black pudding and working at McDonald's and so on, and the implications for non-human moral consideration. How did that journey play out for you, and what were the practical implications? And again, how hard did you find that in a society that is very anthropocentric, coming to that realization?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're often as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit, to use that wonderful phrase from Billy Connolly, when you start questioning, as I did. I don't do this now because it doesn't make for a very good dinner guest, where you'd often, because, food is, I always find endlessly fascinating, and it's a great basis to understand everything from class, gender, speciesism, and, our appalling abuse of the modern human world, where I would ask people, well, where that, came from, that you're now eating that creature. Are you enjoying its flesh, to use that term again? I love using that word, particularly in class, because in English in particular, it really gets you. Even meat is not the same. There's something about the word flesh that really riles people up, I think, and it brings our attention to the existential, almost, nature of what it is we're doing casually by consuming the flesh, and indeed the hides of other creatures and so on. And actually, when you study, as I did, economics, basically all that counted was humans. And in fact, even there, it was even more narrow. All you had were your function as a worker or a consumer. That was it. Nothing about you being a parent or a footballer or an artist. It was really reduced to the basics, as it were, of what it means to be a laborer or a consumer. And of course, the modern human world was just reduced to being resources or a sink, in terms of a source of our effluent and pollution and so on. And again, it's something that, in my later years as an academic, as an educator, I do try and deprogram my students, because, the common sense view of economics, even if you've never studied economics, would be, as I just described it earlier, this thoroughly anthropocentric, pro-market, very narrow view of what economics actually is. And you start saying, well, who counts or what counts? So GDP is a monetized measure of the, usually annual value of the circulation of goods and services in society. But what if, the goods that are circulating are actually harmful for people? In other words, the measure of GDP itself is not measuring what matters. It's simply a monetized measurement of traded goods in exchange. And the question I always used to ask was, well, why isn't the unpaid work of my mother or many other women? I mean, it's slightly better now in terms of the gender division of care labor and so on. But why is that work that my mom does, why does that not count in GDP? Whereas my dad going to a factory or me going to the university to put in a day's work, that gets counted. It's both labor. It's an arbitrary decision that was made, as I discovered later on, by a couple of white guys in the 1930s who came up with the GDP concept, where they explicitly excluded the unpaid work of women. And therefore, what gets measured gets done is the other issue. So if the only thing you're measuring is GDP, it means you're not attending then to the other non-monetized parts of human life and human productive activity. But then if you look at the anthropocentric element, it was, well, there is an economy in nature. In fact, that's what intrigued me about the science of ecology. And ecology and economy, of course, are closely connected. Is that essentially ecology is about the economy of nature. There is a flow of materials, of resources, of pollution within ecosystem. In other words, there's already an economics in nature in terms of a metabolic exchange of materials and waste. And in fact, there's no waste in nature. That's the difference between the human economy as we now have it, and part of the reason why we have the ecological and climate crisis, is that we're building up wastes that cannot be absorbed by the natural world, the most important of which is, greenhouse gas emissions and CO2. Effectively, what we're doing with climate breakdown is we're treating the Earth's atmosphere as an open sewer in terms of pumping out greenhouse gas emissions. So for me, again, just the finish was that there's already an economy in nature. There are already living entities that also labor. They also feel. Some of them even have rudimentary senses of ethical, action, in terms of, whether it's dolphins or the great apes and bonobos and so on, as I learned, when I was studying for my PhD in Glasgow in the early 90s. So in other words, why do we think that there's this irreparable or this strict barrier between humans and non-humans when human beings are a form of animal and all the things that we think make us unique in terms of our ethical sense and, that we're the only ones who can speak and so on. I could see that was very, very flawed, that really we are a special type of creature, to no doubt about it, in the same way that every creature is special in its own way. But we're not unique. And many of the features that I was raised, not just in religious sense, but more in the culture that most of us grew up in, that somehow we were special. Human beings were top dog on the planet for X, Y, or Z reasons. We could use technology. Well, like I say, there's rudimentary uses of technology by great apes and so on. So that can't be a reason why we're superior or better. Our language may be different, but other creatures have their own language and so on. So I completely abandon, in a way, that strict division between humans and non-humans and began to see human and non-human relationships more in terms of kinship, less on a hierarchy of, humans above non-humans, but more in that sense of concentric circles, which does, though, raise the issue that I'll just finish on this, just given that life predates on life, we have no examples of how we as humans can live without destroying and consuming other forms of life. But therein lies then part of the solution. Well, you can eat plants as opposed to animals. We do have, the capacity because we're omnivores. Just look at your teeth. We do have canines. For yes, it's absolutely true that in our evolutionary journey as a species, we did consume, or maybe we had to consume the flesh of other creatures, but we have molars as well, which means we can, get our protein and so on from other sources. So that's what then pushed me to being a vegetarian, and in the last 5 years, I've now made the other leap. I'm now a vegan. I just couldn't cope with losing cheese and milk, to be honest, but actually I overcame them because they were just preferences rather than strict moral principles.
And again, it's similar, I think, with the, switching to use the word flesh. I think when you genuinely are brave enough to open up to understand the basics of the dairy and the egg industries and these other industries, I mean, it's hard to turn away from that when you've really seen it, isn't it? So, yeah.
Particularly because many people would view the kind of vegan vegetarian argument about meat eating, consumption of the flesh, but actually in terms of suffering, the horrendous suffering, and we've measured this, scientists have measured the suffering of the distended, udders of cows to produce the kind of rape pens, if you want to use that term, that may be anthropomorphizing that, pigs are put in and so on. And again, it's the reason why we don't have a lot of discussion about this, certainly not the visual images, because I think once you know something or you smell or you hear the horror, and it is horror, where the cows who are on those production lines, they know they can sense their other fellow creatures ahead of them having a throat slit and so on. And there's absolute terror and fear that those creatures feel. And I think once you know that, it's hard not to know it, which is why many people act like a child does whenever they're told something that's, uncomfortable for them, where they engage in cognitive dissonance, but they put their hands over their eyes and their ears and go, nah, 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 where you kind of block it out. And I do think a lot of people, they feel uncomfortable because they know deep down that what is the justifiable reason for consuming the flesh of other creatures, or indeed, milk and dairy products from other creatures when we have other available alternatives. And it usually comes down to some bullshit, weak argument of taste, or what if we weren't raising to kill them, they wouldn't exist, and so on. I have not come across any credible, strong moral argument for eating the flesh and the other products of animals, when we have very well developed technologies now where we can produce food without actually engaging in these harm causing activities.
Yeah. And I guess there's an obvious question, which is, again, we'll come back to later, which is why don't more people agree with this? Because I think if you if you look across the political spectrum, there are certain political stances that are quite deliberately and proudly about in groups and out groups and polarization and us versus them. And no, I'm quite happy excluding that group because they're not like us, right? And that's pretty clear, right? And they do that within humanity. So, of course, it's understandable that they would also do that between humans and non-humans as well. In a way, that's quite understandable, and it's reprehensible and unpleasant, but in a way, at least they're consistent. I guess I have a higher expectation for people who are, let's say, further left along the political spectrum, and probably the vast majority of the centre as well, who at least in theory will agree with us that, others matter, suffering matters, harm matters, justice matters, and solidarity matters, a phrase that is often used on the left. But that solidarity often seems so brutally selective. So one, you'll see that even then, you'll see that within humanity as well. So there are people who absolutely will rally and cry out for solidarity, but their solidarity for humans is very selective. There are vast swathes of certain humans that just don't seem to get thought of for whatever reason. But it's very obviously, even just as egregious when it comes to thinking about non-human animals as well. So what is it about, I guess, the political left generally that can claim solidarity and share so much of your values, but yet not see these other victims, these other valid others that we should have consideration for?
It's been an enduring question I've had because I've been around far left circles, for 4 decades almost now. I've always been curious, and I've also challenged people, how can we talk about, for example, the importance of reducing suffering? Why are we leaving it? Why are we stopping at the species barrier here? Many people are quite happy to talk about intergenerational justice for humans or global justice again for humans. Why is it? Particularly when it's quite easy, I have found, to challenge people where they are left with no other alternative but to accept what you're saying is the only ethical justifiable position, which is that we extend solidarity to all living, sentient, feeling entities on the planet. Because often, they come up, oh, well, if we start being concerned about animals, we're not going to be concerned about other humans. And I just say that's absolute crap. I said the evidence is really clear. The same people who are giving money to animal charities are the same ones who are out in the streets protecting refugees and defending them. To me, ethical concern is like a muscle. It's not like we have a limited amount somehow, a quantity of ethical concern that we can only give to humans or to animals. That's not how it works. And maybe it's a mark of a capitalist kind of mindset, which is about budgeting. I don't know.
A scarcity mindset about compassion.
Yeah, it's scarcity is, for me, but as I say, I think that I like that analogy, that compassion and care and concern and love and all those good things in life that we don't hear being talked about enough is like a muscle. The more you use it, the more you extend it to other entities that are deserving of our moral consideration. I think it comes down to things like laziness, what the Greeks often called, if I can get this word correct, akrasia, which is a weakness of will. So you're just in a habit. I just like the taste of meat. I don't really have a strong argument for it. So it's kind of an arbitrariness and an unwillingness in a way to follow the logic of the argument, which to me is a sign of moral weakness and or intellectual weakness, that you can agree with the general premise, the directions of leading to the conclusion, but you don't like the conclusion because it would mean a change in your lifestyle or it would mean you may have to make difficult decisions. And at that point, just to finish, I often use this in my arguments with religious people, where I'd say, listen, I'm an atheist, but I've got respect for religion. So I've read the Bible, I've read the Quran, I've read many religious books. And actually in the Bible, Jesus talks about the sin of usury and the sin of injustice against people. So why are you jumping up and down about homosexuality and civil marriage? And it says, is it not a bit too convenient for you as a Christian that you don't want to deal with these economic issues, which your religion is telling you to deal with, make our world a less unequal place economically, because that's the compulsion of trying to right the world and make it a more just world. Well, how different is that from my left-wing friends who will accept that solidarity and compassion and so on is needed, but then stop short of extending that to other creatures which deserve our attention and who are also being exploited. I mean, I think that I in previous work going back 20 years, I did write about and think about the shared exploitation of workers under capitalism. You can extend that to the exploitation of animals, certainly in the factory farming system. So there's a basis, another basis of it. It's not compassion that will motivate you to extend beyond the species barrier. But if you're a Marxist or you're a socialist and you're concerned about ending exploitation, well, why not extend it? We're going to end all exploitation, including of the non-human world.
Yeah, thank you. I share the frustration. But it cues up maybe this final question about how do we make a better future, which again is another crazily broad question for a fairly short conversation. And you mentioned it very early on in our conversation that in a sense, quite a lot of the solutions here aren't really that difficult. Many of them we have in place already. The philosophy might be quite simple. The science might be straightforward. Maybe even some of the technical solutions we need, many of them are in place already. But the problem is political will, social norms, human psychology, and so on. And those themes run through quite commonly in this segment. But yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts about, given that, how do we move forward to a better future, particularly facing the environmental and climate crisis that your work centers on? Because in a way, there's a bunch of different positions people take. There are, the outright deniers who either deny that climate change is happening or deny the human impact. There are the sort of naive techno-optimists who think, don't worry, technology will save us, so we don't really need to do anything because the new tech is coming. There are people that recognize we need a more radical change, technologies and behaviors, but still think we can achieve that within roughly the sorts of systems we have today in the rich West. And there are doomers who are just like, it's all going to shit, we might as well give up. What's the point? You stake out a different position, which is you talk about needing a post-carbon political economy, a post-growth political economy, and maybe even also a post-capitalist political economy too. And I was toying with whether to go through those one by one, and it probably doesn't make sense because I think you were going to tell me they need to come as a package that fit together. I don't know if you just want to lay out the picture just in general terms about what are the characteristics of a future political economy you think we need?
The most important thing is one's theory of change. I mean, it's a question, political activists, they even sometimes think about it all that much, or ourselves as thinking citizens. But, how do you think change happened? And you've outlined some of the ways which many people do, tech changes or modest reform within the existing system, or my own view is much more revolutionary. In my view, we now have scientific reasons for a post-capitalist, post-carbon, post-growth society. Yes, we have loads of normative arguments we can give for that. But now I just cannot see any capitalist solution to the climate and ecological crisis. And if you don't believe me, go and look at the climate science. I mean, increasingly the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've come out with similar position that, we have to have radical changes in all sections of our society, and that tinkering around will no longer do. And so for me, in terms of that issue, well, how do we get there is the really important issue of agency and strategy. Well, the problems with the doomer and the tech solution is that there's no agency required. One says it's too late, where it's all going to shit. We can't do anything. Let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we're going to be dead. And then the other one is, Elon's got this, or, Jeff Bezos, God help us, that some tech bro from California is going to invent some whiz bang technology. We don't have to do anything. So there's no sense of agency. And for me, the element of how do we get there, I'll describe, in a little bit more detail, not too much though, what I think are the outlines of a post-carbon, post-growth, post-capitalist society, is we need to educate ourselves. We need to agitate and organize. I mean, educate, agitate, organize is an old industrial workers of the world, or what we call the Wobblies in America, an old industrial trade union. And I still think they are good guides to what we need to do now. So educate yourself on this issue. And in fact, I don't need to tell an audience listening to this podcast, do not believe anything I've said. Go, verify, look up, have I based it on the appropriate science, on the peer-reviewed articles and so on. You can say yourself that it is. Everything I've said, has the science and social science to back it up. Of course, how we interpret that is obviously open for debate. And the reality is, though, Malcolm X said, we're not outnumbered, we're out organized. And that's part of the problem, is that the forces in society that are beginning to understand, the dire situation we're in, are not very well organized. Basically the fossil fuel companies, the politicians that enable the, senior state actors that oversee our current system, they're very well organized in terms of keeping the system going. And we need to start, becoming more oppositional, in my view. And that includes within the academy, stepping out of the comfort zone of the ivory tower, as it were. But for me, it is about seeing that, the image of a post-capitalist, post-growth, post-carbon society should not be seen in a negative sense. People often present, particularly post-growth, oh my God, I'm proposing going back to the caves and so on.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the obvious challenges people will present post-growth will be to say, well, does that mean, for example, the global poor, their income and wealth is capped where it is? Or if not, and we redistribute radically to help improve their situation, does that mean my situation is going to radically change because the global average income at the moment is something like $7,000 or $8,000? Does that mean that's where everybody is, right, if we're post-growth? Or do you address that by some sort of radical population reduction that no one can ever explain to me how we achieve? So,
no, well, just on the last one, I'm always skeptical of the population argument, because usually put it this way, I do think we have a population problem. Too many fat white Westerners, given the, disproportionate ecological footprint of those of us who live in the global north. And actually, there's often, a dog whistle kind of racism that goes along with those overpopulation arguments. So I'm never convinced by them. But the post-growth position has to be really understood in two ways. It is only for the overdeveloped countries of the global north. So Europe, North America, Australasia, Japan, about 20% of the world's population who are living way outside our fair allocation of the world's resources and its absorptive capacity. The second one is the post-growth position is only applicable at the macro level of the economy. What that means is, so long as the macro level, the overall level of a national or global economy is not transgressing the ecological bounds of pollution that can be absorbed or the regenerative capacity of the Earth's resources, we can have different bits within that economy growing and declining. So, for example, I would like to see less nuclear weapons, for example, less cruise missiles, but more kidney dialysis machines. So long as we can grow and decline sectors of our economy politically as we decide to stay within that overall macroeconomic stability.
And does that also mean that even within sectors you could still have productive growth as long as you find ways to do that within the boundaries? Because I guess one fascinating example is agriculture itself, right? Because there you could imagine the plant agriculture sector growing by 2 or 3 times quite easily while reducing our impact on the planet if we can just transition to phase out animal agriculture, for example. So there's plenty of space for growth there. It's just the right sort of growth.
It is. I mean, I don't need to tell you or maybe some of the listeners, but I mean, it is just a waste of resources to feed the cow the very thing that you could eat and feed more people. I mean, it's a very inefficient way of providing protein.
Yeah, if people understood the basics of feed conversion ratios,
yes,
I think it would just blow their minds. It's like a 90% even higher waste. Yeah,
absolutely. Or even, people don't understand the tremendous carbon footprint of industrial agriculture in terms of the amount of pesticide, fertilizer, feed, all that is an energy story. I mean, essentially from farm to fork, our industrial food system is dripping, particularly in oil. So there's an energy dimension, never mind then a land use issue in terms of our agricultural system. But the reality is that a post-growth society is not this kind of back to the caves position, because it also involves things like, well, let's shift to more socialized forms of consumption. So what do I mean by that? I mean more sharing goods and services like libraries, public transport, laundromats. In other words, how can we find ways of having our needs met in ways that actually are much more ecologically and energy and resource efficient? And it seems to me that, forms of collective provision of things like transport, healthcare, education, and so on. And never mind the ethical arguments around that in terms of, justice and inclusion and reducing inequality. Just functionally, it makes sense to share more and so on. So there are ways, it's called recomposing consumption. So it's not about a reduction in our quality of life. We simply find new ways of providing for our quality of life to attain, for me, what should be the goal of the 21st century is if we're making and navigating this turbulent journey beyond the climate and ecological crisis, which is essentially this: how can we have high flourishing lives that minimize and lower our overall environmental and energy impact on the planet? And there are ways in which we can do that. Mentioned some of the technologies there, or conversion from a very meat-based industrial agriculture system to an agroecological plant-based system and so on. Or as I say, moving away from, you buying from Amazon in terms of a good or service, and we actually share this. Public transport and not individual, even, electric vehicles. I'm not, even though I have an electric vehicle myself, I do not see that is the solution. That's part of it. But it is really more about reducing the need to travel. It's active travel, 15-minute cities, cleaner air and all the other advantages. So that's one element of it, this more socialized consumption. So it's collective ways of provisioning ourselves, and the welfare state led the way on this. So we have to go back to some of those. They don't have this have to be state-led. They could be state, local government, community ways of providing, for our needs. But the Marxist element of this will probably what put people off, is that we need to not just socialize consumption in that way, we need to democratize production. Have people ever asked themselves, particularly those in the world of work, why is it democracy ends at the office door, or democracy ends at the factory gate? Or if you're a student, why should democracy end at the classroom door? I mean, we profess to live in democracies, whereas for most of our waking lives, we live in maybe benign or maybe malign dictatorships where we don't have any autonomy or very little. And it does seem to me there are so many advantages in cascading democracy and democratic decision making into the workplace, into our classrooms, obviously where appropriate and so on, that this will actually deliver not just, benefits in terms of more active citizenship, it would improve people's quality of lives in terms of having more autonomy and control over their working lives. But we have the evidence that democratizing workplaces actually reduces ecological and energy footprints. In other words, it removes this compulsion to grow. The only reason why businesses have to grow is that they're in a capitalist competition with other businesses and so on. Shareholders demand, 3, 5, 6% return on their investments, or have to grow. Worker-owned companies and businesses are removed from that compulsion. So that's what I mean by it's post-capitalist as well, because capitalism is inextricably linked with endless economic growth. It's like a bicycle. Capitalism is like a bicycle. It either goes and grows or it collapses. That's it. It only has two positions. Whereas what we need to do for functional reasons, as I say, scientific reasons, although there are many ethical ones and political ones we can bring as well, we need to find a steady state economy. Nothing in nature grows forever. Ecosystems grow and maximize until they reach a process called homeostasis of a sustainable metabolism between all the constituent elements. And that's what we need to do as a species and as societies. How can we have a sustainable metabolism in terms of a steady state with the inputs from nature and the outputs in terms of pollution that aren't going to cause all the problems we see now with the nature deficit and also then the climate crisis?
Yeah, thank you. And so the post-growth idea isn't about an end to the growth of well-being. Your suggestion is that we can continue to grow and develop well-being, but in a way that is consistent with planetary boundaries and the reality of those, which implies that post, GDP growth, post economic growth model, but not an end to the growth of well-being and are thriving, I guess. So that's a really interesting sort of corrective and a balance, because it still leaves open the space for technological solutions. But I guess your suggestion would be to say, don't put your money on Elon Musk doing something crazy in 30 years. You've actually got to demonstrate the technological solutions today, like plant agriculture, if you want to call that technology. And then it frees up the space for us to do these things. But it was interesting that you went, when you were talking about post-capitalism, you were talking about democracy, because often when people hear post-capitalism or they hear Marxism, immediately they will jump to
Soviet Union. Yeah.
well, yeah, an understandable fear of authoritarianism, and also a sort of an insistence on centralized planning that so far people haven't been able to do very well. Whereas, it says you touched on themes similar to my conversation with Troy Vertesi. You wrote Half Earth Socialism, where again that was his focus, was about democratizing, because we do have this weird situation where liberal democracy is very enthusiastic about corporations that are essentially autocratic. But the theory is that it's okay for them to be autocratic because another autocratic corporation will outcompete them if they take advantage of us. And we can talk for ages about whether that works or whether it doesn't, and corporate capture of politics and so on. But it's interesting that your focus is very much on the democratization as part of the post-capitalist system, rather than a system that gives up on capitalism's freedom and openness and actually brings democracy into production, not just into consumption and politics.
I mean, essentially, again, people often forget that Marx was building on Hegel, and Hegel had a wonderful phrase of the preservative transcendence. So how do we preserve what's best in the current, ditch the stuff we don't want, and then move on? Rather like the way I kind of viewed my own Catholic upbringing. It wasn't all crap. There's some good bits in it, but without the off-world male deity and the misogyny and all the rest of it. In a similar way, we can actually build a post-capitalist future in which we now have, as I say, functional scientific evidence that there is no other way. We cannot have a capitalist free market solution. It isn't working. In fact, what I would say now, we are now in a position of uneconomic growth, in that growth, certainly in the global north and the problems it's now causing around the world. We have passed the threshold beyond which now it's causing more problems than solutions. It doesn't mean to say that the super rich aren't gaining from it. Don't get me wrong. That's part of the reason why this system is still continuing. Very powerful, groups and classes are benefiting from it. But we've now passed the point where, in my view, it's incontrovertible that we now are in a position of uneconomic growth that's causing all these irreparable ecological, problems. The issue of democracy is partly to do with what I see as the radical currency that may help mobilize people behind the vision I've briefly sketched here. It's about meaningful free time. Who wants a 3-day working week? What if we can provide the technological, the economic resources and manage our economy in a way that we have to work a 3-4-day working week? But it means, of course, that we are producing less stuff. That's okay, because we're now providing more stuff rationally in a collective manner, rather than each of us having to buy a car or a ladder. It's always struck me as bizarre. If you go into any suburban household, you probably find you got a ladder, power drill, and so on. How often do we use them? Or not that much, and we don't use them very well. Why can't we have collective ways of having two libraries? And there is evidence of this. There's
universal basic ladders.
Universal basic ladders. There you go. Forward to the revolution for universal basic ladders. I'm sure that'll be a vote winner.
I can see the hashtag now.
So there are ways in which we can provide for meeting our needs, which don't require endless growth, don't require competition, capitalism, and so on. We've seen this during the war. Britain fought the war not on a capitalist base. It was a wartime economy, and it worked. People in Britain didn't starve. It was tough, no doubt about it. I'm not saying we have to go back to the war, but we have examples in probably moving outside our horizon of living memory, where we have organized our societies in very different ways. Or even, at the golden, or at the height of the welfare state in Britain and France and so on, where you had large areas of our lives that were effectively decommodified, where healthcare was not based on your ability to pay, but whether or not you were sick, where going to university was based upon, your ability and your interest, not or, your academic ability, not your ability to pay and so on. And I do think there are elements of moving towards that more decommodified elements of key parts of our lives. I'm not saying this kind of democratically planned economy is for every part of our life, but things like healthcare, transport, energy, food, education, what we used to call the commanding heights of the economy, these should be certainly outside the market system. But I think things like, underwear, personal private electronic goods, fill your boots with a capitalist organization of those things. But the really important things that matter for people, I think we have to take out of that, capitalist compulsion in terms of profit making and commodification. And the last thing I'd say, and maybe Troy mentioned this in his podcast, is that actually Walmart and corporations are leading the way. Not only are they autocratic, as you've said, but Walmart is the world's biggest corporation, over 2 million employees. I don't know how many countries it ranges across. It is organized internally in a non-market form. It is organized in its logistics, the mobilization of resources, its R&D, and all the rest of it, organized in a planned way. So if Walmart can do it across many, different continents, different product lines, and so on, are we really seriously saying we cannot also use some of those methods, and particularly the development which we have now, which we didn't have maybe during the last century of electronics and communication and so on. If Walmart can have a planned economy, well, why can't we have it? And so again, I'm back to the argument for functional reasons as well as democratic reasons, because there are ways in which we can democratize that planning process and rationally use the resources in our society, that we don't actually need to see that capitalism has to be an enduring part of the future. You could say it was a part or a phase in society's development we had to go through, maybe the adolescent phase, the kind of individualistic, selfish phase, and actually we can move on to something different. Why do we think that the future is going to be the projection of the present endlessly into the future? It could be very, very radically different. But the key issue, just to finish, is that this is about creating a better world for people. A world where they do have more meaningful free time, that kids do have decent schools, education, we've got clean air. We are able to have a more rational, way of meeting our food needs that doesn't cause horrendous suffering for animals or indeed for workers. And so for me, I'm quite confident that there's the evidence there for that. I think still people, feel a bit reticent about buying into it fully because often people are small c conservative, that the scale of the changes I'm proposing seems so utopian and outside the realms of possibility. Even though I think when you start describing the world of the future that you want to bring into being, it's like getting a postcard from a beautiful holiday destination. Why can't we have this? And it's all perfectly possible. We don't need any new technologies. We have all the technologies that we need, but we do need political will. And that's why what does give me hope is movements like Fridays for the Future or the trade union movement now getting more behind the importance of climate action and so on. I think it's growing, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, thank you. And I had an interesting discussion, which was suggesting that in a way, capitalism is very good at meeting some human needs, but it's the human needs that are immediate, that are shallow, that are individual. And it's also very good at generating those needs, of course, right? Giving us needs we didn't even realize we had until, the pull is there and the advert is there. But I guess what you're suggesting here is that there is actually a deeper, because you're committed to democracy, you want this transition to happen democratically as well. You're not fomenting a violent revolution to force it on people. There's, in a way, is a sort of sales pitch, a democratic sales pitch to persuade people this is a way towards a better life that is plugged into some of those deeper values and things that really do matter to us, and that pull can be strong enough to take us away from, the next Twitter ad for some Temu product that we didn't even realize existed.
I mean, the reality is, and I don't know whether it might have been the Guardian journalist George Monbiot or somebody else said it. But anyway, the phrase is that nobody in history ever had a revolution for austerity. You will not persuade people what I'm talking about or any other vision of the future if it's going to be their lives are better. So it has to be around, abundance. And for me, the abundance is no longer just a material thing, although we can take care of people's material needs for food, for energy, for shelter, education, health. But it is about saying that there is no limit to the immaterial desires and pleasures of human beings and free time. There's no capacity or there's no limit to our capacity to learn and to love and to, be curious about the world. Many of us are essentially, time poor. I mean, it's a curious element that modern capitalism, with all its technological innovations, providing us with new trinkets and so on, every major technological innovation within capitalism has effectively led to less workers working more rather than more workers working less. I mean, that's to me, the vision that I think a lot of people could get behind, that if we have economic security guaranteed, and I think economic security is absolutely key here. This is not about, people having to, have lower wages and so on. It may mean that we're having more staycations. That's a big issue we need to talk about in terms of how do we have, rest times that are and hobbies and so on that aren't ecologically damaging. I think that's a less issue, but it is that question around presenting an image of the future that is about abundance. But the abundance is not the abundance we have under capitalism, which you need to earn loads of money to buy loads of stuff to impress people you don't really care about. I mean, that's from that movie Fight Club, that's what capitalism is, buying shit you don't need to impress people you don't care about. And, it also challenges the neoclassical economic model that we spoke about earlier. It's based on the fiction of what's called, endogenous, preferences that, in other words, human beings themselves are desiring these things. Well, if that's the case, why do we have a multi-million-dollar industry in advertising and marketing? There is no consumer sovereignty in the way that system actually pretends. But for me, the other element of this democracy is not just in terms of the destination of a more democratized production system where ownership and control are more in the hands of communities and workers, and the state will have maybe a more locally important role rather than a centralized role. I think localization is part of also what I would propose as the future. But actually, in this future world, if people want to see it as something that they would gravitate towards, is actually where, we have more time, where it's not about accumulating and not seeing your children grow up because that's the compulsion that we have. That's because we have a commodified, because housing is commodified, you got to earn money to get a mortgage and so on. And there is, there's so many ways in which I think you can point out that elements of what I'm saying here will just make people's lives better, less stressful, less harried. Yes, it'll be very different. We will have a more, in my view, plant-based, at least vegetarian-based diet, not just because of the reasons of animal welfare, important as they are, just purely from a climate point of view, we know that the most climate-friendly forms of diet are the ones that are less heavy in terms of meat and so on. So again, it's that fusion, if you like, just to finish, I've always enjoyed about kind of green politics or sustainability politics. It has this wonderful fusion of a complementarity, if not a fusion, between ethics and science. We can get this double benefit of having a science-based, rational organization of society that actually also delivers on multiple, what I think most people would accept, good ethical outcomes in terms of justice, equality, inclusion, and solidarity.
Yeah, there's a complementarity there. There's win-wins, and it's not about some brutal sacrifice. And I love the way you put that. It's not about abundance of stuff or money or status. It's an abundance of what really matters to us.
I mean, and that's why, we need to, start really questioning, things like GDP, economic growth. I mean, honestly, those listening to me, does your heart sing whenever, a BBC report, other news outlets are available, talks about British GDP is up? I mean, just today, there's news that Britain is out of a recession, just about. That has not made a material bit of difference to most people's lives. It has made a difference to shareholders and capitalists and those in the city of London, this kind of predatory, form of financialized capitalism we live within. But for most ordinary people, what they want are good jobs, well-paid jobs, decent public services, and so on. The chance of a pension at the end of their working life, rest and an 8-hour day, a lot of things that the trade union movement, have struggled for, for decades, if not centuries. I think what we need is a kind of in my view, a working class or a popular view of economics. And it is away from all this stuff about GDP and, foreign direct investment and all the rest of it. Those things don't really mean anything to most ordinary people. And I think the more we speak a language that people understand, and that's an important issue. I'm conscious of that as I had some, training as a politician in the sense of training, not in a formal sense, but realizing that my academic way of speaking when I started out in politics just was not working. As in, people just didn't understand it. They thought I was being sarcastic. They thought I was talking down at them, and they were quite right. So there was an important issue about how do we democratize the language, even that we're talking about this issue, this transition, and indeed inviting people along in a democratic conversation about, okay, here's your community. It's not doing too good. What do you think we need to do? And I appreciate that sounds terribly twee and simplistic, but I think we can't underestimate the importance of actually people coming together and talking about these issues. Because my sense is that for a lot of people deep down, there's a sense that the current system we have is ending. Now, it's not going to end tomorrow, but there's almost like a sense that it's not maybe a cataclysmic, revolution in the old, Bolshevik, sense of a violent revolution, almost like a catatonic or a degenerative disease that the organism shows signs of recovery, but really it's going back to a lower level than it was before. So I think people are up for, the types of radical discussions that we've been having. And radical here, I mean, not just in crazy, political lefty parlance or woke and all the rest of it that, the right-wing press might characterize what I'm saying. I mean radical in the etymological sense, of the Latin root of that term. Radical means getting to the root. How do we get to the root cause of the problems? And the root causes, in my view, at the moment, are speciesism, anthropocentrism, capitalism, carbon energy, and economic growth. And all those things are connected as we've discussed on the pod here today.
Thank you. And you've laid out some fascinating hints at an alternative future people might be tempted by too. So it's been an inspirational conversation. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add in, or do you think we've answered what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to make a better future in 90 minutes? That's pretty good. But is there anything else you want to add in? But also, what's the best way people following you, keeping up to date with your work, your academic work, your activism?
Yeah, John Barry, Queen's University, Belfast will get you my email. I'm also on Twitter and on LinkedIn, although I like subverting LinkedIn. There's far too many shiny, happy business type people. And I always bring in
It's quite a special place, isn't it?
I always bring in the kind of politics or subvert it by saying, I'm delighted, honored, and pleased to be marking essays or something. So I'd like to leave people with this perhaps thought is that, what if you're the people you've been waiting for? That there is no tech bro coming to save us. I don't think the state itself, as it's currently configured, is going to save us. We're the only ones that can save each other. And we are looking at the end of the world as we know it. But just pause and reflect upon that. That's okay. I'm not talking about the end of the world. It's just the end of the world as we know it.
Thank you. An empowering message. It's up to us.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Please do stay in touch. It's been great to have you as a guest on Sentientism. Thanks, John.